Okay, I think I've thanked just about everyone. As we've been seeing, the Syria crisis has been rather a roller coaster for the last few weeks, beginning, I think, with the chemical weapons attack, which was broadcast on YouTube and other places on August 20th, then followed by, and please forgive me if I'm leaving out some important steps, Secretary of State Kerry's speech on August 30th, in which he basically threatened military strikes against Syria, made the allegations that the US intelligence was indicating that the Syrian government was culpable for that attack. And I don't know about all of you, but I assumed that meant that the strikes were going to happen within days. Then the next day, President Obama says that we're not going to do anything until Congress is consulted. So it ratchets everything down. People are shrugging their shoulders saying, why did he do this? And because Congress is in recess and we have to wait for them to come back. And then there's this whole hoopla about, oh my God, he's made a really bad strategic mistake because Congress will never agree to this, he'll look weak, blah, blah, blah. Then on September 9th, or thereabouts, Secretary of State Kerry again says something which appears offhand, there's speculation about whether or not it was, that maybe if Assad gives up his weapons, there wouldn't be an attack. The Russian government, particularly President Putin, jumps into that breach and says, aha, here's a way out, we'll take away all of Assad's chemical weapons and we'll monitor it, et cetera, et cetera. And then the negotiations begin between the US and Russia to take away the chemical weapons from the Syrian government. On September 13th, President Obama says publicly that he will no longer be pursuing UN Security Council approval for military action. He's leaving it open for US action, but no longer going to go through the Security Council because he doesn't think they'll ever approve it. On September 14th, the US and Russia announce an agreement on the removal of chemical weapons from Syria, in which ground inspectors are supposed to show up by November 1st, and the weapons are supposed to be completely destroyed by mid-2014. And on today, the UN panel gives extensive evidence of the use of sarin gas, although they don't attribute it to any party. But the Americans and others say that the evidence of how and extensively it was used leaves no doubt that the only party who could have used it is the government. And the UN Security Council is now discussing the extent to which they should take action to make sure that the Syrian government lives up to the commitments negotiated between the US and Russia. Now, I'm sure I've left something out, but what is interesting is that the questions that have come up as this thing has shifted over time, the questions have also changed. And here are some that have come up. Should the US take unilateral action to stop the use of chemical weapons in Syria? If so, why wait until now when there have already been 100,000 people in the country who have died? What makes this different? Why, etc. And why the US? Why should the US take this action? What about the lack of support from the American people and the Congress? What about international law and the lack of support from the UN Security Council? And finally, should we trust the Russian effort? I saw a piece on the New York Times website today written by a journalist based in Moscow talking about President Putin. Here is what he is really promising, Putin. Protracted and difficult negotiations on the Syrian project from which the United States will emerge battered and humiliated. with a compromise plan that lacks a convincing enforcement mechanism. A frustrating, expensive, and possibly dangerous attempt to put the plan in place will follow. The civil war in Syria will continue to rage, claiming more lives and robbing the Syrian people of hope with every passing day. Ultimately, the United States and its good faith partners will have to admit the chemical disarmament project has failed, as Syria lies in ruins, still ruled by Assad. So, with those very optimistic projections in front of us, and a host of questions that I've outlined, and many, many more, we have an array of Fletcher faculty who will enlighten us, or at least help us to think more clearly and critically about these questions. The purpose of the seminar or discussion tonight is to explore questions arising from the Syrian war and the continuing humanitarian crisis, and to really say what are the options, the policy options that we might be pursuing at this point. Our speakers are Professor Michael Glennon, Professor of International Law, Antonia Chase, Professor of Practice in Security and International Law, Professor Ian Johnstone, Professor of International Law, and Professor Alex Duwal, the Director of the World Peace Foundation. Each of them will have a short amount of time, hopefully 5 to 7 minutes, to make a sort of an opening statement about some aspect of this and its relationship to policy. I may follow up with a question to each of them, depending on what they say. I will give them an opportunity to then ask each other a set of questions, and hopefully this will all be concluded by 8:15 or 8:20, and then we will open it up to the floor. Okay? Great. So I will ask the faculty members to speak in the order I just mentioned. Professor Glennon, Professor Chase, Professor Johnstone, and Professor Duwal.
Eileen, thank you. Let's try this. Thank you, Eileen, for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me to be here to participate. Thank you all for coming. One of the many joys of being in can you hear me now? One of the many joys of being an academic is that you can almost always use your old notes. Almost every incident or crisis or case raises pretty much the same issues that you've talked about or written about somewhere before. So it's just a matter of hitting the good old search key, and presto, your research is all finished. As the crisis in Syria came to a head, I thought rather happily that I had seen this movie before. Its name was Kosovo, and I had already written my review. I expected that the Syria script would play out pretty much the same. CNN would show the films of atrocities that would make us all gag. The President would gather international support, probably a NATO endorsement, as our Dean recommended. There would be no Security Council approval. The public would grow more and more outraged at Assad's inhumanity. And finally, we would tune into a televised address in which the President would gravely announce that cruise missiles were being launched. So the search and replace command would take care of everything. Strike out Kosovo, insert Syria. Title, Destitute, of course. Unfortunately, a funny thing happened in the British House of Commons. That phony old legislature where members always vote the way leadership tells them how to vote. David Cameron somehow forgot how to count and lost by 8 votes. Now, normally votes in European parliaments create about as much splash in Washington as nominations for the Man Booker Prize. This vote created quite a stir, however, because it reminded members of Congress that the reason the United States was no longer part of Britain was, after all, that we didn't much like our head of state acting like a king. And they started to think that maybe they, our elected representatives, should have something to say about whether the nation goes to war. President Clinton had not sought congressional approval for the Kosovo bombing, but then neither had Tony Blair sought parliamentary approval. Syria started looking dangerously unlike Kosovo. President Obama soon confirmed that Syria was not Kosovo when he walked into the Rose Garden with Vice President Biden at his side and announced not that cruise missiles were being launched, as I had expected he would, but that he was seeking congressional approval. Despite the surprise, this was music to my ears. For even longer than I had mourned the demise of the UN Charter's rules on use of force, I had lamented the flouting of constitutional constraints, of the requirement that the President get congressional approval before attacking another country that had not attacked us or was not preparing imminently to do so. I continue to believe that President Obama did the right thing by going to Congress for approval. I know that a backlash already has begun, that there are those who blame the decision to include Congress for the diplomatic chaos of the last 2 weeks. But the problem has not been too much devotion to the Constitution. The problem has been too little. The President should not have announced his infamous red line before getting congressional approval. He should not have claimed power to attack Syria without going to Congress. And he should not then have claimed power to attack Syria even if Congress voted no. There are a few cases in which the United States Supreme Court has decided war powers disputes between the President and Congress. However, those cases that it has decided are clear. When the President acts in the face of implicit or explicit congressional disapproval, his power is at its lowest ebb, and he can then rely only upon his residual power as Commander-in-Chief, which in these circumstances is 0. It was as short-sighted politically as it was constitutionally for President Obama to have challenged these unambiguous Supreme Court precedents. When he did, his action had 2 effects. First, it created needless opposition in Congress by outraging members who were told that their vote was only advisory. Second, it encouraged irresponsibility by making the ballot not a life or death vote, but a take-it-or-leave-it Gallup poll, a poll increasingly on whether the administration was competent enough to run another war. That was not a referendum that President Obama should have sought. Well, we all know how the movie ended, or at least this episode. Members of Congress concluded with the American people that attacking Syria would be a mistake. Before Congress was able to say that formally, and it surely would have said that formally had the vote occurred, Vladimir Putin threw the President a lifeline. The President grabbed it, and he may well have saved his presidency by doing so. Whether the resulting international agreement will serve the interests of the international community remains to be seen. But let there be no doubt, the interests of the American people were well served by the United States Constitution. The Constitution operated as it was intended to operate. let's give thanks where thanks are due. We got the whole idea of a parliament from the Brits, and I'm glad they reminded us about it. Maybe parliamentary democracy can now begin to make up for the flimsy constraints in international law on the injudicious use of force. Thank you.
Professor Glennon, I have a question for you. You say this is not Kosovo, and you made an argument as to why. What about the legitimate, illegal but legitimate question? That when something is so morally heinous and there are international norms at risk, that hewing to the constraints of the UN Security Council are problematic and we should do what's moral even if it's illegal?
I don't know what legitimacy means, and I think that it's a mistake for the proponents of this analysis based upon legitimacy to, in effect, substitute a new subjective method of validation for international law. We talk about morality, we talk about fairness, we talk about justice. Now we've got to become experts in legitimacy as well. I don't know that the approval or disapproval of the world's population by an international Gallup poll should have any effect on the application of international norms, any more than the approval or disapproval of an unlawful act under national law should have such an effect. So I think that anybody committed to the notion of the rule of law has to be very troubled by the emergence of this whole idea that the law can somehow be set aside whenever any potential transgressor is able to conjure up some legitimacy argument, which invariably means anything they want it to mean.
Thanks. Professor Chase.
This is a great occasion and one that I think we should do more of, and I think we will. I was asked, what policy should we be following? And my answer is, our policy now is to follow the US-Russian agreement and keep the threat of force alive. I don't think there would have been an agreement without the threat of force. And I think it's a blessing, in a way, that the Russians intervened. I don't know if it's a lifeline or whether it's a very calculated and clever political move to keep Assad in place and to keep the Russians in the center, or whether it's a black swan, just something from out of space. I have to say, I supported a limited strike, and I supported it with a very heavy heart, as I had done in Kosovo. I think the distinction of legitimate versus legal is a throwaway. I agree with Michael, and I am a lawyer, and therefore I'm very uncomfortable with ever recommending anything that is illegal. But nonetheless, the argument that I made, and I thank Alec Duval and Bridget Conley, who couldn't be here, the World Peace Foundation, for continuing, for first writing what he wrote and then continuing this thread of discussion among the faculty that started with a dinner that I gave for the LLMs coming in, and that was before the Russians. So I think what moves me, and what moved me in the beginning, was for the first time, we've spent years and a good deal of funding to establish the concept that the international community has a responsibility to protect suffering populations. It is not the law, and people had been trying to invoke it in the Syrian situation. I don't think there's any basis for using R2P as a justification for military action absent the Security Council authorization under Chapter 7. The high-level panel and then the World Summit outcome of 2005 really rejected it. Ian has written a marvelous article on necessity, and it might be used to justify humanitarian intervention in extreme cases. But there's confusion as to whether that doctrine is justification, rendering an unlawful act lawful, or whether it serves as an excuse to mitigate the consequences of an admittedly unlawful fact. Those are the British domestic cases about eat the cabin boy when there's a shipwreck. That's what they did. And they were held guilty of murder, but not sentenced very much at all. I think maybe there's a further justification. It isn't very powerful, and that is that we've spent so much time trying to create a norm of no use of weapons of mass destruction. And the world has fairly much come to that. There have not been much use. 1988, in the gassing of the Kurds, the U.S. did nothing, and neither did the international community. Nevertheless, that's what I've been struggling with, and thank goodness the black swan took place, because as I say, it was for me personally a struggle, but one where I came out with the necessity to strike. And really, why now? And why 1,400 people and not 100,000? Because that's a violation of a norm that would kill many, many more people. Now, what should we think about this agreement? I think it's a black swan in another direction. We know how to inspect. Both the U.S. and Russia have done it since 1972. We have the Iraq experience, and there's a marvelous editorial by an expert, Jessica Matthews, in the September 13th or 14th Washington Post, which I commend to you, in which she says, quote, "A little known truth about the Iraq War has much to tell us, positive and negative, about the prospects of dealing diplomatically with Syria's chemical weapons. The inspections carried out by the United Nations and the IAEA were anything but the fool's mission poo-pooed by the Bush administration. In fact, they were a striking international success. It didn't take 1 year, it took basically 10 years, and there was unilateral, Desert Fox strikes every time the Iraqis got fractious and uncooperative. David Kay tells a grim but almost funny story about being locked in a hot bus on a parking lot in Iraq in the mid-90s. UNSCOM, which was created by the UN Security Council, Resolution 1284, and then afterwards UNMOVIC, really saw to it that those chemical and biological weapons were destroyed. Okay, we know how to do it. We've done it also together with first the Soviet Union and now Russia. We have DITER, which used to be the OSIA, inspecting nuclear weapons reductions, and they're very professional. So this is lucky in a way. We know how to do it, and it can be done. I commend that article to you because it gives a lot of detail about how it works. Finally, the goalposts, let's face it, have moved. Our first goal was to stop the use of chemical weapons. I think that's happened. And by the way, the threat of the use of force is just as illegal under the UN Charter as the use of force. So you can't say it's okay to threaten and not to use after. So the game has changed. In one sense, from denial to confession on the part of the Syrians, and from no use, which I think we probably accomplished, to elimination. That's a very much bigger goal. But it will not stop the war, and there will be consequences, and we won't accomplish peace very quickly. I don't know what's going to happen, but if we can establish the norm, and if we can do it legally now, that there is no use, not just no first use, but no use of weapons of mass destruction, the world will be a much safer place. Thank you.
Now can we hear from Professor Johnston?
Great, thanks Eileen. Thank you all for being here. Certainly a surprise to see so many people. I don't think I've ever seen so many people in this room other than for convocation, and even then the fire rules apply, so probably not then. I want to start with just one introductory point. When I saw that what we were being asked to speak about was the policy implications, or how do we move forward on policy, and saw that we were 3 lawyers on the panel, and I'm a lawyer, and I'm probably going to have something to say about international law, I thought I should try to justify, in my view, why these legal issues are worth discussing in the context of a policy debate. And that's simply because international law and international politics are intertwined, and the efficacy of any policy depends in part on whether it's perceived to be legal. And I think how much it depends, of course, varies with the circumstances, and it varies with which states you're talking about. So it may seem to have less impact on powerful states, or less democratic states, or states that perceive the international system as having been created by others and therefore illegitimate. But even those states tend to need allies and supporters, and that's when international law kicks in. So that's a way of kind of explaining why lawyers can be here and can be talking about these issues. Now, just the current state of play. As of this morning, the UN presented its report saying chemical weapons had been used. The Secretary General briefed the UN Security Council, and in that briefing he said a war crime had been committed. There had been a violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol for the prohibition of the use of asphyxiating poisonous or other gases. Syria is a party to that protocol, and he said customary law had been violated. Syria has now acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention, but it wasn't a party on August 21st when the chemical attacks occurred, and so whether that convention had been violated is moot. But there are 2 bits of international law at play here: the humanitarian law, the war crime, and then the weapons of mass destruction, the chemical weapon-related law. But they are related because the prohibition against the use of chemical or biological weapons is largely because of the severe humanitarian impact they can have and the indiscriminate humanitarian impact. So we're talking about a humanitarian law principle as well. The report did not specify who used those weapons, but the US, the UK, and France all very quickly said the evidence is clear. The way the report is framed, it's clear that it must have been by the Syrian government forces. Russia, of course, said, not so fast, don't jump to conclusions here. Now, meanwhile, we have this agreement that was reached on September 14th in Geneva. And that agreement calls for, and I'm quoting here from the agreement, special procedures for the expeditious destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons. Expeditious procedures are needed because the plan calls for the complete destruction of the production equipment by November of this year, and all of the weapons by the middle of next year, by the summer of 2014. And if you use the normal process under the Chemical Weapons Convention, that's impossible. It may be impossible even if you use expedited procedures, but under the normal pace of things, that's absolutely impossible. countries that have destroyed their chemical weapons, who are required to by the convention. South Korea took 11 years, India took 12 years, Russia and the US are still at it 16 years later, and they're talking about maybe getting it all done by the year 2021. So this takes decades if they're big chemical weapon programs. The plan calls for it occurring in Syria within a year. That means, of course, that these expedited procedures are going to require a Security Council resolution. And that's in the cards, that's in the works right now. They're talking about trying to get a resolution in the Security Council by the end of this week. They're waiting for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to provide a more detailed plan than the framework agreement provides, and then the Security Council will in effect endorse that plan, probably under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And then it may not look entirely unlike the Iraq inspections regime, which, as Tony pointed out, worked. It actually succeeded in dismantling most of the production facilities and getting rid of almost all, if not all, of the chemical and biological agents that Iraq had. Why it worked is an interesting question. I think the main reason is the pressure of sanctions. I actually think the economic sanctions are a better explanation than the threat of the use of force, but the threat of the use of force was always lingering out there and was used a couple of times with respect to Iraq. But I think the collective wisdom or conventional wisdom, it was really to get out from under the burden of the sanctions, which led to any progress that did occur in Iraq during those years when the inspectors were there. Okay? Now the big question is, what if it doesn't work? You know, what if the regime doesn't work? And what if the Security Council is not complied with the Security Council resolution? And the Russians have made it absolutely clear that while they may be able to live with a Chapter 7 resolution, they can't live with a resolution that even hints at the possibility of the use of force. And that means that, at least according to international law, you go back to the Security Council. If Syria fails to comply, you go back to the Security Council, and the Security Council decides what to do about it. And the Security Council could decide to impose sanctions. The Security Council could decide to authorize the use of force. But that, of course, depends on the Russians coming around and not exercising a veto. This is where the current position of the Obama administration becomes interesting, because they're saying force is still on the table. And they're hinting that if we start down this path and we have a Security Council resolution and the Syrian government doesn't comply, then we'll act outside the Security Council. And that's an interesting and a difficult argument to make. I suspect that the way they would make the argument is they're enforcing the collective will. Okay? They're enforcing the international community's collective taboo against the use of chemical weapons and Security Council resolutions, even if they're not acting explicitly under the authority of the Security Council. And I don't like that argument, and I don't think that argument is going to win much support, because in effect it says that the US becomes the world's policeman. If there's some violation of international law, as a Security Council resolution or some other important piece of law, then somebody's got to enforce it, and if not the Security Council, then it might as well be us. And I think that's a dangerous position to take, and I think that position is not likely to get much international support. The only argument for the use of force that I think would have any chance of getting support is the one that Tony mentioned, Professor Chase mentioned, this notion of humanitarian necessity as an excuse. I call it an excuse rather than a justification, but an excuse for violation of the law. And this is not the same as a doctrine of humanitarian intervention or an application of the notion of responsibility to protect. The first requires state practice and opinio juris, and I don't think that exists, so I don't think we have a customary law doctrine of humanitarian intervention on the books. And as far as R2P, the responsibility to protect, is concerned, it's absolutely clear from the 2005 World Summit that this requires Security Council authorization. So what the necessity excuse says is that in extreme circumstances of humanitarian need, violations of the law will in effect be pardoned. Okay? In practice, what that would mean is the international community will in effect turn a blind eye to the violation. Okay? They won't condone it, they won't say we see this as legal and we thank you for doing it, but the violator of the law won't pay much of a price for having done it. And arguably that's what happened in Kosovo. Okay? Now whether that kind of defense could be or would succeed in Syria depends a lot on the facts. Okay? So if it turns out that it's just a little bit of foot dragging by the Syrian government, then obviously not. But if the whole inspection system collapses and there's a real prospect that the regime is on the verge of using chemical weapons again or is committing mass atrocities in other ways, then it is conceivable in my mind that large parts of the world would be prepared to turn a blind eye to military action without Security Council authorization. And so the policy implications of that are don't take force off the table. If push comes to shove, go back to the Security Council. If the Security Council is paralyzed and mass atrocities are being committed or the use of chemical weapons again is imminent, then act, throw yourself on the Court of International Public Opinion and plead necessity. Okay? Now I think the chances of us getting to those circumstances are very unlikely. I think it's much more likely that you're going to see foot dragging, you're going to see arguments about the scope, degree of compliance, whether the government's cooperating, where the weapons are, where the inspectors are being allowed and where they're not being allowed. And in those circumstances, use of force would not be either legal or excusable, and we're thrown back on diplomacy, and that, I guess, sort of opens the door to Alex's comments, which is the prospects of this resulting in some political solution as opposed to a military one.
Before I turn to Professor DeWall, I'd just like Professors Chase and Johnston to speak to something a little less technical. Excuse me, I don't mean to, never mind. The legal arguments are extremely important.